Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Diep falls into a coma and doesn't wake up, leaving James to torment himself. Watch until the end of the video to see their journey of love. Morning light slipped softly through the curtains, casting a muted glow over Diep's pale, unmoving face. She lay in silence, wrapped in stillness. The back of her head was covered with a white bandage, and her breathing was barely perceptible. A fragile thread between consciousness and oblivion. James sat quietly by her side, gripping her cold hand as if letting go would erase her completely. His eyes were bloodshot, his body frozen, unwilling to accept the possibility of losing her. Behind him, James's father stood by the doorway, phone pressed to his ear, his voice trembling. "Please, send me your two best doctors. The address is kindCEO commune, Tanman Hamlet." That was all he could do, for now. When he ended the call, he walked over and gently told his son, "Go to work. I'll stay and take care of Diep." But James didn't move. He couldn't. He sat there, anchored by love and fear, unwilling to leave the woman who meant everything to him. The boiling water had long gone silent. The breakfast on the table sat untouched. No one ate, no one spoke. The house was full, yet hollow. Time passed slowly, cruelly, like it had forgotten how to move. Still, in that thick silence, a small light remained. Hope. It flickered, stubborn and soft, refusing to die out. Because sometimes, in the quietest moment when all seems lost, just one blink, one breath, one sign of life, is all it takes to bring the world rushing back. James stood still at the entrance of the lumber factory, but his heart remained behind, back in the house where Diep lay unconscious. He didn't want to leave, but the police had arrived. The investigation into the timber shipments from John's company was underway, and because his family's company had once worked with them, they were now involved. The officers wasted no time, asking about shipping records, invoices, contracts, and how closely they were connected to John. James answered calmly, clearly, but the tension never left his chest. He knew that even one misstep could bring everything down. Sweat collected along his neck, but it wasn't from the heat. The coldest part of his day was still back home, in that room where Diep hadn't moved. At home, James's father cared for Diep with quiet hands. He boiled water for noodles, wiped the table, checked her temperature, and called the hospital 3 separate times within an hour. There was no noise, no talking, just the steady rhythm of regret. Everything he did seemed like an attempt to undo something he couldn't take back. He just wanted her to wake up, so he could finally make amends. As James left the factory, a message lit up on his phone. "Doctors haven't come. She's still unconscious." He gripped the phone tightly, lowering his head against the steering wheel. When he arrived home, he didn't walk in right away. He stood at the gate for a long breath. Somewhere deep down, he feared that what waited behind the door had already changed forever. But still, he turned the handle and stepped inside. Whatever it was, he had to face it. Only 2 remained in the room, Diep and James's father. He sat on the edge of the bed, his tired hands gently resting over hers. A soft breeze passed through the half-open window, but the chill inside the room had nothing to do with air. His eyes were heavy with years of regret. He leaned closer and spoke quietly, not to wake her, but like someone confessing to the silence. "I'm sorry for standing in your way, for not letting you come with us. I never thought it would end like this." His voice was rough, carrying a weight that no one else could measure. He looked down at her, the girl who had shielded him, taken a blow in his place. She now lay motionless, her face calm, but the silence was unbearable. There were no accusations, no words of anger, but somehow that made it worse. "Please, wake up," he whispered. "If you do, I won't interfere anymore. You and James, you'll have my blessing. I owe you more than I can ever repay." At that moment, James entered the room. He didn't speak. He saw his father seated beside Diep and simply joined him in silence. Two men, with guilt and love between them, sharing the same quiet vigil. Outside, the sun had risen, casting light across the yard, but inside, the room remained dim. Not because of the curtains, but because of fear. Hope lingered, faint, flickering, stubborn. Somewhere in that stillness was one question no one dared to speak aloud. What if she doesn't wake up? A knock cut through the silence. Tung, one of Diep's close friends, stepped into the room with a heavy expression. He walked in slowly, placed a small gift bag on the table, and asked softly if he could visit her. When his eyes fell upon Diep lying motionless on the bed, his face darkened. He stood still for a moment, then sat down quietly, shoulders tense. Seconds passed before he spoke, but when he did, his voice was sharp. "Why is she like this? Why is there a bruise on her neck? Why hasn't she woken up?" His eyes locked on James. The room grew heavy. James didn't answer. His head lowered. His mouth opened, then closed. "I'm sorry," James finally said, barely audible. Tung's voice rose. "You always say sorry, but look at her. She's the one paying the price." Before James could reply, his father stepped forward. His tone was deep, calm, but filled with weight. "This is not James's fault, it's mine." Both men turned toward him, surprised. He continued, "I made choices that brought her into this situation. She got hurt because of me. If anyone deserves blame, it's me." Tung stared at him, fists still clenched. Then, slowly, he gave a slight nod. "If anything happens to her, I won't forgive you. Either of you." He stood up, bowed slightly, and walked toward the door. The silence that returned after he left was deeper than before. 3 people remained. 1 unconscious, 2 waiting. And in that still air, a quiet, unspoken promise lingered. One that had yet to be fulfilled. The house fell into a heavy, lingering silence after Tung left. James's father stepped quietly into the living room, while James remained beside Diep. He stayed still, unmoving, his eyes fixed on her peaceful face. His hand brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, his voice a soft whisper, barely audible. "I just want to stay here with you. Forever," he murmured. Then, slower, his words heavier, "But I have to go. The police are at the factory. They need me. I'll come back soon. Please, wait for me." He bent down, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and stood. Then, a faint sound. Barely there, but different, like a shift in breath or a whisper through silence. James stopped cold. He turned sharply toward the bed. "Diep?" His voice cracked with disbelief. She stirred, her brow tightened. A broken voice escaped her lips. "Run! The thieves!" James rushed back, grabbing her hand. "Diep, you're awake, it's me, I'm here." Her eyes blinked open. Confused at first, trembling with fear. Then slowly, her gaze found him, and the panic faded. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine. I'm right here. You're back. That's all that matters." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if anchoring her to life itself. His tears came, but not from sorrow. This time, They were full of overwhelming relief. In that one fragile moment, everything else disappeared. All that remained was her warmth, her breath, and a heartbeat that had returned from the edge of silence. The doctors from the hospital finally arrived, nearly an hour behind schedule. James had just returned home when he saw two people in white coats stepping out of a car. Without hesitation, he rushed to greet them, his expression a storm of worry and fragile hope. James's father welcomed them inside, his hands trembling slightly as he poured glasses of water. The doctors got to work immediately, moving toward Diep's bedside. They checked her vitals, felt her pulse, and monitored her breathing. "All vital signs are normal," one of them said, though his brow furrowed slightly as he pressed a stethoscope to her chest. "Her heartbeat is irregular. We'll need to keep an eye on that." The female doctor gently lifted Diep's head and moved her hair aside to examine the wound. "It's a mild sprain in the neck area. No fractures or deep tissue damage," she noted. "But the extended unconsciousness is more likely from physical exhaustion combined with psychological shock." James, still holding Diep's hand, asked quietly, "Does she need to be hospitalized?" "Not at this time," the doctor answered. "You can support her recovery with nutrient-rich fluids like milk or protein supplements, especially if she can't eat yet." James's father reached into his pocket and offered them a small envelope. The doctor declined politely. "We're just doing our duty. Please, we can't accept that." The tension in the house eased just slightly. Diep was awake. The danger had passed. But James didn't relax. His eyes stayed on her, unwavering. They all said she would recover, but for him it wouldn't feel real until she smiled again, the way she used to. The following morning, the police returned to the house to finalize paperwork and deliver remaining evidence related to the timber investigation. Among the items was a motorbike confirmed to be James's. One officer handed over a document and said in a low, calm voice, "The case involving Mr. John has officially been closed. Thank you for your cooperation throughout." James's father gave a quiet nod and replied with measured steadiness, "Thank you. We're ready to continue cooperating if necessary." He then turned to a nearby worker and instructed, "Take the motorbike back to the warehouse. Also, notify the others. We'll shut down for 3 days to give the authorities space to finish their work." Inside the house, Diep was resting. Her breathing had stabilized. James sat beside her, watching over her in silence. He no longer panicked, no longer rushed. There was only stillness, a quiet presence filled with gratitude. The chaos had passed. The apologies had been said, the anger had faded, the truth had surfaced. But healing, emotional healing, would take longer. Some scars linger, not on the body, but deep inside. Outside, the morning sun spilled across the courtyard, reflecting off patches of rain left from the night before. A street vendor walked by, whispering to a passing customer, "She took that hit for him." That's what love does. It hurts. No one responded. But somewhere, everyone seemed to hear it. Maybe not with their ears, but in their hearts, they all repeated the same thought. Yes, to love someone, truly love them, has never been easy.
Diệp, một người cô gái tốt bụng, đỡ thay cho bố James trong một vụ xung đột, khiến cô rơi vào tình trạng hôn mê. James đầy lo lắng và đau khổ, không thể rời khỏi cô một giây nào. Cầu xin cô tỉnh lại, bố của James cũng đau đớn, nhưng chỉ có thể đứng im lặng, cảm nhận sâu sắc nỗi tội lỗi của mình. khi để vô tình thế để Diệp vào tình cảm này. Trong khi sự sống của Diệp treo lơ lửng tình yêu của giữa James và cô để được thử thách qua từng giây phút, liệu tình yêu và hy vọng có đủ sức mạnh để đưa cô trở lại? Câu chuyện đi qua những cung bậc cảm xúc khiến người ta phải suy nghĩ về tình yêu và sự hy sinh.